We are wildly off the track that we want to be on. It's the worst thing you could see.
Ah, that is bad news.
Want to know why? That's what we're asking on The Climate Question after the news.
BBC News with Neil Nunes. The leftist former rebel Gustavo Petro will face an unexpected rival in Colombia's presidential election runoff next month. The independent 77-year-old businessman Rodolfo Hernandez has knocked out the conservative candidate Federico Gutierrez. President Joe Biden and his wife Jill have concluded their visit to the Texas town of Uvalde to offer their condolences to families bereft by Tuesday's mass shooting. They visited memorials at the Robb Elementary School, where the gunman killed 19 children and 2 teachers, laying white roses and paying respects to makeshift shrines to the victims, and attended Mass in a local church. Israeli police say 70,000 Israelis have taken part in a march through Jerusalem's Old City. Many chanted, "Death to Arabs." The annual flag march is organized by Jewish nationalists to mark Israel's capture in 1967 of East Jerusalem. It's seen as a provocation by Palestinians. The Ukrainian band who won this year's Eurovision Song Contest, Kalush Orchestra, have sold their trophy at auction for $900,000 to raise money for the war in Ukraine. The funds will be used to buy drones for Ukraine's military battling Russia's invasion. The authorities in Brazil say the number of people known to have died following torrential rain has risen to at least 56, with more than 50 others still missing. Officials said rescuers were using a lull in the downpours to search for survivors. President Jair Bolsonaro says he'll travel to the state capital on Monday. In cricket, Gujarat Titans have won their maiden Indian Premier League title, defeating Rajasthan Royals in the final in Ahmedabad. IPL is the world's wealthiest cricket tournament, attracting players from around the world. BBC World News.
There we go.
This sets the tone
For our story of the bad boy of greenhouse gases.
Methane is so bad primarily because it's a very strong greenhouse gas. It is extremely good at trapping outgoing radiation, which all greenhouse gases do, but methane does it much better than many other gases.
battling the bad boy, Drew Shindell,
the lead author of a big UN-backed report which led to a dramatic moment last year.
I want to thank all those countries that have signed up to the Global Methane Pledge. With this global pledge,
more than 100 countries signed up to cut methane emissions by almost a third by the end of the decade.
This is really astonishing, having been writing reports about climate science for decades now, for something to lead so tangibly and quickly to a direct effort to put the conclusions of a scientific study into place is just unheard of.
Just before the pledge was signed, methane levels were spiking.
And so what I was really hoping was last year was an anomaly. Maybe it was just this random fluctuation.
There's been new data this year, and
it wasn't a one-time thing, and now we are not just near a record, but have the fastest growth rate in our almost 40 years of data. And so we are wildly off the track that we want to be on. It's the worst thing you could see.
This is The Climate Question from the BBC World Service.
With Kate Lamble and Neil Rosell. Today's question:
why are methane levels rising?
Our search for answers will take us around the world and literally into the belly of a beast.
First, though, meet Xin Lan.
Growing up from China, I saw, the impact of the air quality and what human beings is able to do to influence the atmosphere. And that slowly got me interested in the greenhouse gas emissions from human beings.
Today, she's in the United States, where she's a greenhouse gas scientist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association.
She's been tracking this invisible gas with the help of people in every corner of the planet.
The way we do it is that our collaborator, they would take a glass flask sample and shoot it back to us for analysis.
So you just get a little flask of air that's come from Alaska or a little flask of air that's come from Africa, and you get to sort of plug it in and see what's in there?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. We have air from Alaska. We have air from South Pole.
They get 15,000 bottles of air sent to them every year.
Her postman must love it.
I know. And SEEN analyses the amount of methane in each sample. There's a trend all over the world. Levels are rising.
Can she tell why it's happening?
Yeah, so methane is made up of carbon and hydrogen molecules. And by looking at tiny variations in the carbon, she can tell where the methane formed.
So we believe the rise after 2007 is predominantly driven by microbial emissions.
Microbial emissions. There's a new villain.
Yeah, it was the microbes in the dining room with a lead pipe all along.
Makes a change from the usual suspect, fossil fuels.
So fossil fuels also increasing, but it's just at a smaller rate than the microbial increase.
Methane is often released directly into the atmosphere from oil and gas wells. We made a whole programme about it, which you can hear on BBC Sounds. Just look for a show called Why Can't We Stop Gas Flaring?
Right. Now we're talking about a microscopic methane-producing life form called methanogens.
It produces methane in an environment that have no oxygen. So that environment can happen naturally, for example, in wetlands when the soil is saturated by water. And in that case, the methanogens can produce methane. And that environment also happens in landfills when a lot of waste is buried and the oxygen is very limited inside.
Methane levels are rising then because there are many more of these tiny organisms around.
This is a natural process, but it's being driven by humans. And to understand how, let's start in Bangladesh.
The BBC's Akbar Hussain is in the capital Dhaka on a very windy day.
I'm standing in a rooftop where I can see thousands of buildings around me. Just, other side of the building is a huge landfill, I can see. And obviously, because of the landfill, the area is very full of bad smell. So it's not possible to get too near to that. That's why I'm standing a bit far away from there.
This is one time I'm particularly glad to be in the studio. This is one of the main dumping grounds for a city of 22 million people.
I can see industrial waste, commercial waste, medical waste, plastic and food waste. All are dumped here.
I can only imagine waking up and trying to have breakfast or dinner with that smell overpowering you.
Yes, it is. People say that they have to always close their windows shut. Whenever they open it, they see hundreds of flies, mosquitoes, and insects coming in from the landfill. I have spoken to some local people that told me that it was very difficult for them to live here.
This landfill is very harmful to health. Bad smell is always there. Smells turn horrible when there is rain. Everyone will say that this landfill is harmful to health.
This smell is produced by bacteria which love waterlogged conditions where there's not much oxygen around. And while methane itself is odourless, SEEN's told us that the microbes which produce it thrive in exactly the same environment.
The dump, like many things in Bangladesh, is built on a wetland. So when it rains, the water rushes there and the methanogens kick into overdrive.
So these landfills in Dhaka, they're producing 4,000 kilograms methane gas every hour.
The methane is just blasting out. It's the equivalent of leaving almost 200,000 cars running.
And here's the kicker. As Bangladeshis get richer and consume more stuff, chances are they'll throw more stuff away. So these rubbish piles are set to get even bigger.
Meaning more methane. And not just in Dhaka. Lots of cities have giant landfills full of microbes happily going about their lives. And actually, the gas they produce doesn't just warm the planet. Close to the ground, it can react and become toxic.
Stand by. What am I going to do with you? Stand by. What am I going to do?
Good question, ladies. Drew Shindell, who chairs the scientific panel of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and was the lead author on that big methane report we told you about earlier, he's got 2 bits of good news for us.
If we want to reduce the damages that are already accruing from ongoing climate change, from worsening storms, from heat waves, from fires, all the things we're seeing, if we want to really make a dent in those in the next 30 years, methane is the strongest leverage we have.
Is it seen as an easy win for the climate?
Well, unfortunately, on climate, I would say very little is easy, but relatively speaking, yes.
We should explain this easy win idea. And when I say we, I mean you, Kate.
Okay. Look, methane is more effective than other greenhouse gases at trapping heat. So by cutting a small amount of emissions, we can make a relatively big impact on temperature rises.
Okay, that makes sense.
And there's another thing. Methane doesn't last in the atmosphere for very long. It's only around 10 years before it starts to break down.
Right, so if we can stop putting it into the sky, the problem will eventually dissolve, go away.
Well, the methane problem will go away. But CO2, the kind of badder boy climate gas, that hangs around our atmosphere for more like a century. So cutting methane now might buy us more time to deal with that other problem.
Okay, let's stick with the good news for the moment. Drew's second bit of positivity is that tackling methane doesn't have to cost a lot of money. In fact, it can make money.
If you capture methane, well, that's natural gas, right? We use tons of that, and every bit you capture means less you have to extract out of the ground. It means you have something you can sell. You can burn it on site to make electricity. You know, there's all of this makes the financial calculus, when you look at the cost and benefits of reducing methane, very, very attractive. In fact, a very large portion of the methane reduction solutions that we have at our fingertips actually pay for themselves over just a couple years. There are places like the city of Monterrey in Mexico that powers their whole rail system for the town from the landfill. And this is a lot of power you can generate.
Hang on a minute. They power their entire rail system just with methane gas from landfill?
Yeah, it makes enough electricity to power the light rail system.
Wow.
Is it a big light rail system, or is it like one train going back and forth?
No, it's a decent size.
Huh.
I like the way Neil's like, I'm sure there's something to this. It's just one train going back and forth.
It's like a Lego train, right?
No, it's like a real tram system.
I've just looked it up. It's 50 electric trains along 40 stations across 25 miles, 40 kilometres.
There we go.
Wow.
That's proper.
This is exactly the plan for Dhaka in Bangladesh.
There's no railway, but a Chinese company has a contract to build a facility which would capture the methane from these landfills and turn it into energy.
It's meant to come online in 3 years. And to be clear, burning the landfill gas will still result in some emissions, but they'll be less efficient at trapping heat than the methane, which would have been released otherwise.
Plus, it'll produce electricity and cut dangerous local pollution, so it's a big improvement. We gotta let Akbar get away from the smell.
Yeah, let him step inside, take a couple of deep breaths.
But away from the rubbish, off in the countryside, those methane-producing microbes have found another happy home.
It's connected to something Bangladeshis can't do without.
We get hungry, we lose our temper, we cannot concentrate on our work because it's a culture, it's a lifestyle.
He's talking about rice.
And he's not exaggerating. Many Bangladeshis eat it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. 3/4 of all cropland are devoted to it.
Which is a problem, because rice is grown in flooded fields, which offer the perfect oxygen-free environment for methanogens to live in.
Humnath Bandari works for the International Rice Research Institute in Dhaka.
One of the strategies to control the methane emission from rice field is to reduce the period of flooding. That will reduce the activity of the microbial bacteria and then reduce the methane emissions.
The idea is that a few days after planting the rice, you can drain the field, wait for the water level to drop, and then flood it again.
After a few days, you drain the field, wait for the water level to drop, and then flood it again.
After a few days, you drain the field, wait for the water level to drop.
It can save like a 30% irrigation water And also normally in Bangladesh, irrigation is used through groundwater irrigation. That means they use diesel or electricity. So which means it also saves about 30% diesel and electricity and reduce the production cost by about 1/3.
And the research shows it produces just as much rice without as much methane.
You know what's making me feel really optimistic, Neil?
Go on.
Well, we often sit here on this show and we say, there are these solutions, but they need money or technology.
Yeah, right. Or politicians on side or something like that.
Yeah. But here, it's so much easier. These small farmers, they don't have to buy lots of kit. The changes could even save them money.
Not just in Bangladesh, anywhere where they produce rice.
Yeah.
But if we're looking at agriculture, there is something which produces a lot more methane than rice paddies. And, sorry to kill your vibe, it's much more difficult to solve.
Livestock is a really hard one because we don't have technical solutions to, say, capture methane coming out of all these cows that are roaming around in fields, right? They're all individual sources. It's not like a single coal mine or power station or even, landfill.
Here's where we get to the belly of the beast. At the University of California, Davis, Ermias Kabrab has been puzzling over just this.
A quarter or so of the methane is emitted by livestock.
Wow. Oh, so that's very significant. So if you can get that down, you're going to be seeing big gains.
Yes, absolutely. Dairy cattle and beef cattle is the main contributors to methane emissions. If we are able to drive it down now, in the next 10 years or so, we can see this reduction in climate warming.
Inside cows' 4 stomachs, there are oxygen-free conditions, just like in wetlands or landfills.
And surprise, surprise, methane-producing microbes have also made cows' stomachs their homes.
It helps them to digest their feed, and in that process, methane is being formed, and that methane mostly is burped out by the cow.
We shouldn't just pick on cows. Sheep, goats, and other animals also use these microbes to ferment their food as part of digestion.
But cows are crucial. There are 1 billion of them worldwide.
And with more and more people now able to afford meat and milk, those numbers are set to rise further, pushing methane up too.
But fear not, Ermias has a cunning plan.
So what we're trying to do is to actually reduce the amount of methane that's been burped out.
Neil, why are we hearing ocean sounds? Have you pressed the wrong button again? Because we are talking here about the famous land dwellers, the cows.
Just bear with me, bear with me.
Okay.
What we've been focusing on is using feed additives. And feed additives are things that are given to the animals in a very small proportion. You give them the same diet as you give them before, but you add this feed additive, and that would substantially reduce the methane emissions.
And we're at the ocean because...
Well, this is where one of the additives which works comes from. It's seaweed.
This specific seaweed, the compounds in it, that inhibits the microbes that are responsible for methane production in the stomachs of animals. It inhibits them so much that in some cases we have seen up to 98% reduction in methane emissions.
The science is not completely settled. Other calculations found the same seaweed reduced emissions by around 80%.
Terrible joke aside, that is a huge impact.
Once it's been harvested from the sea, it's freeze-dried, and then it's crushed and it becomes like a powder. And what we do is that powder, we mix it with molasses. Molasses is a typical feed for animals, and they can eat it with their feed. And, in very small amounts, they won't even notice it, and they will eat it happily.
The cows are satisfied and unharmed. Scientists even did a taste test.
Not of the seaweed, we should be clear, but of the cows themselves. There's no difference to the taste of their milk or meat.
Seaweed is harder to give to cattle which graze freely, but California has already authorized the supplement so it can start making a difference right now.
And so, how many animals could be eating this supplement now?
It would definitely be millions. Just in California, we have 1.7 million dairy cattle, and almost all of them, you have access to them and to be able to give them this supplement.
Other supplements aimed at reducing methane production have recently been approved by the EU, Brazil, and Chile.
All this, of course, costs money. Ermias grew up in Eritrea, so he knows farmers in low-income countries might not be able to afford seaweed-seasoned additives. For them, he's got a different idea. If they can feed animals according to the latest farming techniques, then farmers could produce the same amount with fewer animals.
Which would mean less of this. He's created an app for farmers to use from Vietnam to Ethiopia.
They basically need a little bit information from the farmer, what kind of animal they have, and how much production they want, what kind of feed they have available. And then they put all of this into this software, and then they will tell them this is how much grass, how much of concentrates, and how much of this or byproducts you need to provide in order to get this amount of productivity.
And the effect could be that rather than needing 10 goats, for instance, to produce, a quantity of milk, they could do it with 5, for instance.
Yes, exactly.
Landfills, rice fields, cattle ranches. We've heard there are places all over the world where humans are creating the perfect home for methane-producing microbes to thrive. They're all contributing to the rise in emissions.
But the thing is, Seelan, who's been studying these changes, says it might not just be that humans are really good at throwing a party for methanogens. Actually, it's natural production in wetlands which might be the crucial piece of this puzzle.
With the climate change, the warming temperatures that we are observing right now, wetland methane emissions is likely also increase. That's because the methanogens that produce methane will become more active when the temperature is higher.
So humans are doing things to increase methane levels, but also because we've increased our carbon dioxide production as well as methane, that is having an ongoing cyclic effect, a feedback loop, if you will, and it's making the problem worse.
That's correct. That's what we are concerned is happening. But it's very difficult to know this for sure because of the limited amount of measurements we have over wetland and year-to-year variability. So it's still an ongoing investigation as whether we are actually seeing this, what we call the climate feedback.
Even the idea that climate change itself could be creating more methane is terrifying.
I know.
It could wipe out the gains we're hoping to make in cutting emissions.
But if you're thinking to yourself, just drain the swamps, that is a bad idea.
That's because wetland plays a quite important role in our ecosystem. It also acts as a natural buffers for severe flooding. When a lot of rain happens, it can hold some of the waters instead of flooding the city, for example. So the more straightforward actions we can take is to reduce the human part emissions of the methane emissions.
That brings us full circle.
I want to thank all those countries that have signed up to the Global Methane Pledge. With this global pledge...
With what we now know, putting this pledge into practice becomes even more important because the target, a 30% cut by the end of the decade, keeps getting bigger.
6 months since the announcement, more countries have signed up, funds have been raised and experts identified. So a dramatic increase in emissions was not what experts like Drew Shindell were hoping for.
Does that mean that the pledge is not working?
You wouldn't actually expect methane concentrations in the atmosphere to drop so quickly. So I would say it doesn't represent a failure of the pledge, but it does mean that the bar over which the methane pledge has to achieve is higher. Right, because if the emissions are going up, getting to 30% down is all that much higher hurdle to jump.
I mean, Drew, I know you're sat in a school right now recording this with us. Is the report card saying, enthusiastic, tries hard, but needs to see results?
That's a perfect version to say it. Yes, exactly.
Climate change has seemingly endless negative consequences, but I'm not sure I realised that more planet-warming gases could be one of them.
It's startling. It means we need to take an even harder look at the contributions we make to these emissions, like what we eat, what we throw away, and what we burn to make energy.
But let's look at the positives for just a second. With methane, we have options for change, ones that work, which are affordable, which can make life even better.
Relatively easy wins. We should grab them with both hands. right, Kate, that music tells us it's time for the Climate Belt. What have you seen in the climate news this week?
So, Neil, are you a crypto bro?
No, I'm certainly not.
It's a shame because I want to talk about cryptocurrencies this week, like Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is an entirely digital currency, which in climate terms has become quite controversial because of the amount of energy it uses. Now, estimates vary, but some say Bitcoin alone uses as much electricity every year as the country of Thailand.
Really?
Yeah, so obviously, if that electricity is produced using fossil fuels, more emissions are going to be warming the planet.
Okay.
With me so far?
With you.
Good. Okay. So Bitcoin miners are always looking for big profits, and so they're looking for the cheapest electricity possible. And in recent years, they come up with some really interesting ideas. They've purchased gas, which otherwise would have been burnt or flared off for absolutely no reason at gas wells. But there's this really interesting story from Jessica McKenzie at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and she talks about how in Pennsylvania in the US, one company has just been found to have installed dozens of generators directly over their own gas wells, specifically for the purposes of mining Bitcoin. And experts say that fossil fuel owners can make twice as much money using the gas to mine Bitcoin as they can from selling that gas onto the open market.
Wow.
Which is astonishing, right?
Right.
But some of these wells which people are connecting to have either been abandoned or they're due to be permanently plugged to stop gas escaping. So the only reason this gas is being burned and emissions are happening is because of Bitcoin. Otherwise, the gas would have stayed in the ground. Neil, what have you seen in the news this week?
Well, my story is about researchers who've taken a more bourgeois approach and have studied climate change through restaurant menus. So this is a team at the University of British Columbia, and they wanted to test the claim that rising water temperatures will have effects throughout the food chain. So they went through hundreds of menus stretching back to the 1880s in 3 coastal cities, Anchorage, Alaska, Vancouver, British Columbia, and Los Angeles in California, and they searched the menus for seafood, perhaps with a glass of white wine in hand. Their peer-reviewed paper doesn't say. Then they calculated the average temperature preferences of the seafood in the wild.
Okay.
And they found that in Vancouver restaurants, jumbo squid were kind of creeping in. Chefs had pretty much ignored them before the 1990s, but since then they're becoming much more common as the squid move into warming waters.
So this is about the winners from climate change, that some animals, they're going to be able to expand their boundaries, that we're going to see lots more of them, rather than suffering because the climate is changing. And actually,
that's right.
Instead of that being a problem, restaurant owners are like, fab, let's put that on our menus.
Fine, humans will eat them.
We can't just put a gigantic solar farm in the Sahara Desert. If you have any bright ideas like that you want to be road tested, do send them to us. climatequestion@bbc.com.
Thanks to researcher Imi Rhodes, producers Alex Murray and Serena Tarling, series producer Alex Lewis, editor Richard Varden, and the man who makes the mix, Tom Brignall.
This is the BBC World Service with Emma Barnett looking back on 70 years of Queen Elizabeth's role as a global stateswoman.
This is a story about perhaps the world's most famous woman who has had an extraordinary influence at the centre of world affairs.
The level of knowledge and understanding was immense.
They unburden themselves. Sometimes one can help in that way.
The Royal Diplomats at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. And in 30 minutes, it's Pick of the World with Anna Doble.
I want to know what you clicked or shared this week. The women footballers of Mariupol who drove back into their ruined city in Ukraine? Or was it the worrying spread of monkeypox getting your attention?
Next, it's Tech Tent on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This
is the BBC World Service. I'm Zoe Kleinman, and on Tech Tent this week, UK regulators take aim at the world's best-known facial recognition company, Clearview AI. The firm has amassed 20 billion photos of people that it's taken from the internet. But if you are on the database, you probably don't know it.
Here's another amazing one, usually out there in the background of another photo.
Oh my goodness. See that one? That one's amazing. I don't even remember what that is.
Could understanding your menstrual cycle make you a better athlete? This Olympian tells us it might.
I think that I would have been able to train smarter. I think that when you get to a certain level, every small incremental change is hugely important.
And
certainly to sweep the floors, keep the counters clean.
Cooking would be nice. Oh, putting the sheets on the bed. As a major tech firm teases plans for home robots, we ask what chores you'd most like to automate. That's all to come after the latest world news.